Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's program. I'm Sonia Feldman with Action Annapolis. We're a nonpartisan grassroots group here in Greater Annapolis. Our goal is to provide information to our community on topics that we feel are critical to an informed electorate. We'd like to thank our partner for the evening, the Chesapeake Bay chapter of the American Institute of Architects. Thank you also to Strong Towns for supporting tonight's program. You can visit the Action Annapolis Facebook page and watch other programs in our affordable housing series. We've discussed the history of racial discrimination in housing, both nationally and here in Annapolis. You'll also find our program on eviction prevention, all on our Facebook page. This evening, we're continuing the conversation on affordable housing by taking a look at the role that ADUs, accessory dwelling units, can play as one strategy for filling what has been referred to as missing middle housing. Missing middle housing helps fill a gap in the housing market. By increasing the number of diverse housing options, communities can work toward building neighborhoods that are more inclusive and economically competitive. They can serve to better reflect the racial demographics of an area, or to accommodate aging parents who want to maintain a level of independence, or young adults who cannot find an affordable place to live, a person with disabilities who benefits from family support, and middle-income families who have been priced out of the market. ADUs can be one strategy that can help to achieve many of these goals without changing the character of our neighborhoods. Tonight's speakers will be focusing on an overview of ADUs, what they are and how they've worked in other communities. We'll also be touching on how all of this can apply to us here in Annapolis. Please join us again for our second session on April 20, when we go deeper into the local view. We'll be featuring a panel of local city and county legislators. You can get all those details on our Facebook page and website at actionannapolis.com. If you have a question to ask our speakers tonight, you can submit it in the comments section right here on Facebook Live. We'll try to get to as many of your questions as we can. And now, Emily Legum with Action Annapolis will introduce our guest for the evening. Thanks again for being here.
I joined Sonia in welcoming everyone to this event. I'm very excited to introduce Kol Peterson. Kol is a prominent national expert who has helped catalyze the rapid growth of ADUs in Portland and the Northwest over the last decade. As a consultant, Kol promotes ADU education by providing courses for homeowners and realtors and advises local governments and communities on legislative initiatives and public policy. He received an advanced degree from the Harvard School of Design. Kol lives the ADU life. For the last 7 years, he has lived in an ADU in Portland. He is the owner of Caravan, a tiny house hotel, and he runs the ADU tour in Portland that highlights the city's ADU structures. He is also the author of Backdoor Revolution, a definitive guide for ADU development, including design, cost, community, impact, and public policy. Kol is familiar with Annapolis as he worked for the federal government, first as a new media analyst for the White House, and then as a research fellow at the EPA. Kol told me he is a big fan of Annapolis and visited often when he lived in DC. We are also fortunate to have Alex Pline with us. For the past 35 years, his day job has been with NASA, but Alex has always been interested in the nexus of transportation and land use and their impact on how neighborhoods are developed. For 15 years, Alex has been an active member of Annapolis Strong Towns, an organization that supports creative initiatives in the planning of our communities to provide the most desirable living spaces. He is also a member of the Annapolis Planning Commission, which reviews proposed developments and makes recommendations on comprehensive development plans. And finally, we have Luke Tudwell as the audience assistant. So welcome Kol, Alex, and Luke. And with that, I'm going to turn the program over to Kol.
Thank you so much for having me today. I'm excited to speak with the community about ADUs. I'm very passionate about them and have a lot of information to share. So I'm gonna, I already got a nice introduction from Emily, but I'm gonna go ahead and introduce myself a little bit more in the context of ADUs, because I think it plays into the broader scope of things that I wanted to talk about today. So without further ado, I'm going to share my screen. Presentation. Okay. So this is me. I wrote this book, Backdoor Revolution, The Definitive Guide to ADU Development. I also run buildinganadu.com, which is a website that hosts information about the book and also a course online. And it has a whole bunch of other information. So if you're interested in ADUs and you want to learn more about them, I'd recommend signing up for my email campaign there, and you'll get a whole lot of free information. I also run a website called accessorydwellings.org with a couple other people, and this is kind of a group blog that hosts a lot of national information about ADUs, a lot of firsthand anecdotes of people's stories having built them, how much they cost, who the designer was, who the builder was, what troubles they had, pictures of the ADUs, floor plans, etc. This is my contact information down at the bottom. So I've built and lived in 2 different ADUs. I actually live in a daylit basement conversion ADU right now, which is where I am right now. But previously I lived in a detached new construction ADU for about 8 years. I run the citywide ADU tour, which generally has about 1,000 people or so coming to it when we run it. And we've run 5 or so of those. Teach classes for homeowners and realtors. And I've been teaching a class for homeowners for the last 10 years, taught 2,500 homeowners or so and about 2,000 realtors. In Portland, it's like ADUs are prominent enough that every single person who owns a house would know what an ADU is. Every single realtor has to know what an ADU is because all their clients want to know, can I build an ADU on this property? It's that's how deeply steeped into the fabric of the culture, I guess you could say, or just like the architecture of Portland ADUs are at this point. I consult with homeowners about ADUs. I did one this morning. I did one yesterday for people who are thinking about building ADUs. I'm not going to be talking about tiny homes per se, but I do have one leg firmly implanted in the tiny house on wheels world and know quite a bit about that. If people want to talk about that, I'm happy to. And incidentally, I'll just side note that Portland is on the cusp tomorrow, perhaps, of passing the legislation that would allow for tiny homes on wheels to be legal habitable dwellings and not be counted as an ADU. It would be above and beyond what your ADU entitlement would be, which is, in my mind, part of the same trajectory of allowing for creative urban infill housing that addresses the market rate affordable housing space that ADUs also fill, but even more so than ADUs because they're less expensive, because they're smaller and they're on wheels, they're not on foundations. I have a pretty strong policy hat, having worked in the federal government, but I also worked specifically on House Bill 2001, which is an Oregon statewide bill that allows for middle housing statewide, which is duplexes, triplexes, and fourplexes, as well as ADUs statewide in every single jurisdiction with no poison pills in them. And we'll talk about those poison pills later. So that's a statewide mandate that kind of supersedes local jurisdictional code. And that's a new trend that we're seeing now in California. We're seeing new bills being floated for that in a lot of East Coast states, not the least of which is New York is about to announce a big statewide bill that's going to supersede local jurisdictional code. I also run an academy called ADU Academy, which is for professionals that are interested in earning or kind of upping their game with ADUs if they're a designer, builder, lender, realtor, or appraiser, and an ADU specialist accreditation with an organization called Earth Advantage. And that's kind of a professional designation. And then I consult with city, states, and organizations about ADUs. So this is all I do, ADUs. I live, breathe, eat, sleep ADUs all day long. I love them. I'm very passionate about them, and I have a lot of firsthand narrative or firsthand professional experience with them. Not a builder, designer, but I know a lot about the design and build of ADUs as well. This is the blank slate that I started with 10 years ago. Backyard, green lawn, and conceived of it of an ADU with the notion of having creating a housing that would my idea was I wanted to create financially sustainable housing for myself. How can I eliminate the most expensive costs that I have in my life? And quickly, thought of, a number of different things related to housing, like what could I do to reduce my housing costs? And learned about ADUs at that point and decided an ADU was the right way to go to buy a house, buy a single family house, build an ADU, move into the ADU and start renting out the primary house. And lo and behold, built this ADU, lived in it for 8 years. It was awesome. And subsequently, it did, in fact, the primary house income didn't, from as a rental, did in fact cover the mortgage, and the whole ADU had essentially paid for itself in 4 years. And now, I live rent and mortgage free for the rest of my life and no longer have housing costs. And that has liberated me financially to do what I love, which is this, incidentally, but it doesn't have to be ADU stuff that I happen to love. It's just anybody who ends up following that formula can essentially do the same thing. And this is the second house that I bought. This was not a good looking property when I bought it, but I did some improvements to the exterior and renovated the upstairs. So it was a standalone unit. And then I converted the basement level to an ADU. So this is south facing exposure here. And this is where the great room is. And then in the back are 2 bedrooms. And so this is a 2-bedroom, 1 bath in the back and 3-1 upstairs. And then in the back of this property, I'm going to build another detached ADU once the new regulations come into effect that allow for 2 ADUs on a property, which is happening on August 1st here in Portland. This is what it looked like previously. This was just an interior of a garage, and now this is what the great room looks like. So it's basically a gut rehab when we're talking about interior or a basement conversion or a garage conversion ADU. So let's get more into talking about now beyond my story, what ADUs are and what they look like and how they function. So ADUs are secondary housing units on single family lots. And it's a very simple definition, but it's actually kind of complicated when you get into the weeds of it. Secondary, it's usually a secondary, not a third or fourth housing unit. And that is because most of the time jurisdictions only allow for 1 ADU. Now that's changing on the West Coast now. A lot of jurisdictions, including the entire state of California, allow for 2 ADUs. Portland is going to be allowing for 2 ADUs. Vancouver, British Columbia is going to be allows for 2 ADUs. Seattle allows for 2 ADUs. So really, as we talk about ADUs, there's there's a series of things that need to happen to kind of create the kind of housing that we need as a policy matter, and ADU is kind of the one step in that, but it's not the final step. The second step is 2 ADUs, and the third step is middle housing, and all those are really important in terms of addressing the kind of demand that we have for the type of housing we need in single-family residential zones. And so you'll hear elements of that, but we're really going to focus in on ADUs. So this is a garage conversion ADU. This is an ADU above a garage. This is a detached new construction ADU, and this is a basement conversion ADU. All these are viable structural forms of ADUs. They're all secondary housing units on single family lots. They're just different structural forms. In Portland, where all structural forms are permissible, and hopefully where this will be the case as well in Annapolis, what we see are roughly 25% of ADUs are garage conversion ADUs or ADUs above a garage. Roughly 25% are basement conversion ADUs or other internal carve-out ADUs. And then roughly 50% are detached new construction ADUs. So that's what we see in a natural market condition. That can morph a little bit depending on the jurisdictional codes and the type of stock that's in the community, but generally speaking, Portland's, I guess, a representative community of similar age housing stock as Annapolis, perhaps, maybe a little bit younger, I guess. In any case, so secondary housing unit on a single family lot. Now they don't have to be on single family lots, but generally speaking, ADUs are on single family lots. They do have to be subservient architecturally to a primary dwelling unit. So if you have a commercially zoned piece of property, for example, you could have, or at least in Portland, you could theoretically have an ADU on that property if you had a residential primary dwelling on the front half, but usually commercially zoned properties are used for commercial uses. So usually you see them on residential properties. And then lastly, it's a housing unit. What is a housing unit? Well, a housing unit is a space with independent sleeping, sanitation space, bathroom, living space, and a kitchen. So a kitchen is really where it gets more complicated, though, because a lot of jurisdictions will allow for you to do additions to your home as long as you don't add a kitchen, because that is the indicator that you're putting in a secondary dwelling or a secondary habitable unit. And so a lot of jurisdictions will say, yeah, you can add additional square footage to your property, or even you can add a detached bedroom in some cases, but you can't add a kitchen to it because God forbid it would be a standalone unit in that case. So it's really the kitchen sink and the stove that oftentimes that are the building code definitions that trigger it being a quote unquote kitchen. And the kitchen is what triggers something quote unquote being an accessory dwelling unit. So, in that we can go down that rabbit hole quite a bit if we want, but I'm not going to right now. So, this is the quintessential ADU slide that summarizes some of the interesting facets of ADUs and the motivations of why people opt to build them. In 2010, this family with a child, baby, have the yellow house that they live in and the brown house in the back, which is the ADU. And they're generating some income. 2020, they have 2.3 kids and move into the ADU and the primary house because the mom or because the teenage daughter wants to have parties with her friends, and the dad needs to have a place to work because of COVID during the day, and they want to have a place for granny to come in and visit the family once in a while. So they're kind of using all the spaces because they're a big family. And then 2040, they become empty nesters. The kids go off to college and they're like, you know what? We are so glad we built this ADU because it's accessible. There's no steps to get into it, which is good because I'm now on a walker and I can't get up the 3 steps that it takes to get into the primary house anymore, but I really want to stay in this property. And oh, by the way, we want to generate income and retire a little bit earlier than we had thought because we don't have to pay for our housing anymore because that primary house income will pay for everything and then some. So we're going to downsize, move into the ADU, and rent out the front house. And so this is kind of the quintessential ADU life cycle. And in fact, it does summarize some of the most prominent or dominant motivations of why people are building ADUs. According to a 2013 study that we conducted in Portland of permitted ADUs, it was the first statistically valid study of ADUs in the country. The Oregon Department of Environmental Quality funded it. We, in fact, found that 90 to 95% of the motivations of why people were building ADUs were passive rental income potential and multi-generational household flexibility. Primarily, actually, passive rental income was the primary driver, but secondarily, multi-generational household flexibility. And it's usually a combination of those two things. It's usually a whole bunch of different answers that people say about why they want to build ADUs, and that's great. That's kind of what makes them special, is that they do fill a bunch of different roles all simultaneously, which are kind of embodied in some of the elements of this slide. Another interesting facet of ADUs is that this family is living on this property for 30 years. Now, the average American household lives on their property for 5 to 7 years. And unlike the average American property, this property has an ADU, and the ADU has afforded them that structural flexibility to actually stay on that property if they wanted to, which maybe if they just had a primary house, they wouldn't be able to. And they maybe wouldn't want to live in a 4-bedroom, 2-bath house when it's just the 2 of them. They don't want to pay for the utility bills, and they don't want to pay for the upkeep of the capital improvements that are needed on that kind of size house. So they are glad to have this smaller structure that they can live in. But also it's accessible, right? Maybe they designed it to be accessible, so they can live on this property for a longer period of time. But another interesting facet that's just more raw numbers is it doesn't really make sense for this. Once they've built this ADU, it's not something that makes financial sense on the front end. Like in the first few years, once you build an ADU, it costs a lot of money. We're going to get into costs later, but it's not something that's going to be a lucrative investment out of the gate. Rather, it's something that makes more and more financial sense the longer they hold the property. And so it's a type of housing that is only built by people who have long-term vested interest in the property, as opposed to people who are only have short-term vested interest in the property, that is speculative developers. Speculative developers aren't building ADUs. It's really people who are holding on to the property for a long period of time. Who hold on to residential properties for long periods of time? Homeowners. So homeowners are the agents of ADU development, unlike every other housing form we see in the United States, which is generally built by professional developers. And that makes ADUs different than all other housing forms in that, unlike every other housing form, we have to somehow turn the average homeowner into a developer of a piece of property. And that takes a lot of work. It not only takes making the regulations really good, it also takes making the financing really good. It also takes a lot of education and handholding to enable homeowners to kind of become developers of properties. It's not a simple task. I like to say that building an ADU is kind of the second biggest project that you'll ever do in your life after having a child. And if you've never had a child, like me, it's the biggest project you'll ever do in your life. So it's a very major endeavor and not a simple one. Prior to working in ADUs, I did a lot of work in the environmental kind of in a variety of different environmental fields. And what caught my attention about ADUs was when I started to look at the environmental impact of buildings. In a very intuitive sense, you can imagine that the smaller the building you live in, the fewer greenhouse gas emissions you'll have associated with that dwelling. In this case, an average standard size home, 2,200 square feet, produces roughly 710,000 kilograms of CO2 in the course of the life cycle of that building. And when we talk about a life cycle of a building, we're thinking about a 76-year life cycle. And we're talking about the construction, the habitation, and the deconstruction of that building. And so quite obviously or intuitively, the smaller the dwelling, the less energy it will use. But what becomes more profound than this is when we look at it over a single year. If you take that average size house built to code, which means the least amount of insulation and air sealing you can possibly put in and get by, or past code, that building in the course of a year will use 90 million British thermal units of energy in the course of the year, primarily for heating and cooling, because heating and cooling is what it's how we use most of our energy on a per capita level in our residential building sector. But if you reduce the size of that, if you increase the amount of insulation in that building and air seal it well, if you weatherize the building, it'll use far less energy. If you build it to high performance standards, and that's awesome. But what's really amazing is that if you simply build an ADU to the nominal building code standards that are required, that ADU will outperform. It'll use less energy than that high performance home that's built with all the bells and whistles that's an average sized house. So even without trying, these folks are outperforming. They're using less energy. They're building a more energy efficient home than these folks who are putting a lot of money in solar panels and extra good insulation, et cetera, et cetera. And then if these folks actually care about that stuff and they really want to reduce the energy even more, they can make that building high performance and it'll use far less emissions still. I should note, however, that this should be thought of on a per capita basis. So 5 people living in this average size house are going to use less energy per capita than 1 person living in an 800 square foot ADU. But I'll explain why that's not necessarily so relevant on the next slide. The next slide shows that, in fact, if you look at the housing construction in the United States, roughly 3/4 of the homes that are being constructed, according to the US 2010 census data, are single family homes, 3 bedroom, 2 bath, whatever, something like that. And then some portion of the housing stock are single family attached houses, some portion of the housing stock are row houses, and then some portion of the housing stock are multifamily construction. In bigger cities, we're going to see obviously more of that. So Washington, D.C. is going to have more of that than Annapolis. It's a new construction, but in smaller towns are going to have more single family homes being developed as new housing stock. And then if we look at the housing demographic demand, what we see is quite a polarized mismatch between the demand for housing and the supply of housing. What we see is only about 1/4 of households these days are nuclear family households. That is, married couples with children. 3/4 of households are single people with children, married couples living together without kids, unrelated people living together, and single people living alone. That is the demographic composition of what we see right now in the United States. Yet this is what we're building. And so immediately we can start to see there is a big disparity between the demand and the supply of housing. let's bust that apart a little bit and talk about why that is. Well, the biggest change is that over the last 70 years or so, we've seen household sizes shrink. And this is resulting from a number of different trends that are going to seem obvious now, as I say them, which are we are living longer. And as a result of living longer, the proportion of our life that we have children in the house is shorter. And so the proportion of our life that we're living in a nuclear family household is shorter, and therefore we're living in a 1 or 2 person household with our partner or alone for a longer portion of our life. That's number one. Number two, we're having fewer kids. Those of us who are having children are having fewer of them, and more people are choosing not to have kids. So those two things result in more 1 and 2 person households. We're also getting more separations and divorces than we used to. And lastly, there's just a lot of 1 and 2 person households that are forming that are, in the kind of baby boomer generation at this point. So we're just seeing a lot of shift in this direction of smaller households that is resulting in a really changing demographic from what we saw in the 1940s, which is what we're still building our housing stock for. We're building our housing stock for the 1940s. We just haven't caught up with where our housing needs are at this point. And if you look at this even further back to the 1900s, the trend is even more obvious. We saw a lot of 5+ person households back in 1900, but nowadays that represents only 9.5% of the population, whereas the 1 and 2 person household demographics have both been steadily increasing since the 1900s. And even more exacerbating than that, if you look at major cities, you're seeing huge portions of the housing demand being in the 1 person category. So in Washington, D.C., the closest city to Annapolis in this graphic, 45% of all the households are 1 person households. Meanwhile, the single family home sizes are steadily increasing since 1950, same time period, to 2015 or 13. Home sizes have steadily increased over time. And that sounds great until you start to think about that environmental footprint fact that I was providing previously, which is now we're actually going from 292 square feet per capita in 1950 to roughly 1,023 square feet per capita in 2013. So if you believe in climate change or you're concerned about climate change, you start to think about the impact of housing, residential housing, which by the way represents 22% of our total greenhouse gas footprint in the United States. Start to realize that we are going in the exact opposite direction of where we want to be going. There's nothing you could do in terms of creating green homes, adding all the green bells and whistles that would address this fundamental problem, because even a high performance home is still using a lot of materials, and to get those materials and deliver them and deconstruct them in and of itself has a big energetic footprint, let alone just the habitation of that dwelling. So if we look at the zoning, and this is from the city of Portland, the blue areas of the map represent multifamily zoning, and the yellow areas of the map represent single-family zoning. Unfortunately, I don't have a similar demographic or a similar graphic for Annapolis, but what we see is we're roughly, half the map is blue, half the map is yellow, but this map is from 1927. This is no longer what our zoning looks like. This is what our zoning looks like today. What we see is a lot of areas of the map are turning yellow over the course of 100 years and turning into single family residential. And more areas are getting kind of whittled away from the multi-family zone and turned into single family residential. So we're seeing a shrinking proportion of the land being allocated to multifamily use, which means uses or areas where you can build multifamily housing in it, and more areas of the map are being restricted to this low density form of development, which it creates this inexorable challenge because as our population grows, or even if it doesn't grow, given these trends that we're seeing with demographics, even if our population wasn't growing, we would still need more housing to accommodate the same number of people. And I'm sure that Annapolis's population is in fact growing, and that it's experiencing the exact same trends as the rest of the country in terms of household sizes shrinking over the last 50 years. So inevitably, this is going to create a affordable housing crisis because more of this land is being locked into this form of zoning that allows for just one type of large house that doesn't meet the demographic demands anymore. So these are the pressures that we are experiencing in coastal cities across the US and the trends that are contributing to an affordable housing crisis. And so in the face of this challenge, what cities are now doing is looking at the success of ADUs and then doubling down in that direction, not just saying we're going to allow an ADU, but rather we're going to allow every property to have 2 ADUs. And not only that, we're going to allow properties with duplexes to allow ADUs. And not only that, we're going to allow triplexes and fourplexes on every single property. Every single family residential property is now going to allow this in all of Portland, and in every major city in all of Oregon is going to allow this because of this set of problem statements that I just went over. Furthermore, in the city of Portland, they are eliminating all off-street parking requirements in acknowledgement that off-street parking is probably the single most challenging barrier to development of housing. And so, the challenge I would put out there for any city that's looking at liberalizing codes for ADUs is, what's more important, habitat for a vehicle or habitat for a human being? And I would put that challenge squarely in Annapolis lap as well, and I'll talk more about that. And so this is House Bill 2001, which is the bill that stipulates that every jurisdiction may not require owner occupancy of ADUs anymore, which is to say a lot of jurisdictions say, we'll allow ADUs, but you have to live on the property because we're concerned about, the change that we're going to somehow alter the character of the neighborhood if we don't require the owners to live on the property. This is a non-issue. I mean, it doesn't. There's no reason for that particular regulation. A lot of jurisdictions do it, especially on the East Coast. But it is what prevents a lot of ADU development. In fact, no jurisdiction in the United States that has a lot of ADUs has an owner occupancy requirement. So hopefully that won't become part of the proposed regulations in Annapolis. And the other big poison pill for ADUs is off-street parking, and that is a lot of jurisdictions will say you can build an ADU or 2 covered off-street parking spots, and it just isn't geometrically possible to fit both an accessory dwelling unit and an off-street parking spot, plus the fact that you're embedding a lot of additional cost into the development of an ADU by requiring off-street parking, which is inherently making that housing more expensive, and it's prioritizing, again, vehicle habitat over human habitat if you have to make that trade-off. So there's a lot of good reasons not to require it, but nonetheless, a lot of jurisdictions that are trying to create more ADUs or trying to liberalize their ADU regulations still require off-street parking, and I'm here to say it doesn't work. There's no jurisdictions that require off-street parking that actually have a lot of ADU development or any ADU development really. So, so I would recommend not requiring off-street parking in any ADU ordinance. So as a result of liberalizing ADU regulations, which we're going to go into here in a little bit more depth, we have had dramatic success with ADUs. The number of ADUs started to double in 2010 when system development charges were waived for ADUs, which I'll talk about here on the next slide. And that number has doubled since 2010 to about 2018. And now it's kind of tabled off a bit. But we now have about 3,000 permitted ADUs, which is a lot of ADUs relative to every other jurisdiction in the United States. But guess what? That only represents 2% of all of the single family residential properties in Portland. So even in the best case scenario, where there's an affordable housing crisis and very liberal regulations for ADUs, we are not seeing every property have an ADU. We're not seeing 10% of all properties have ADU. We were lucky to get 1% a couple of years back, and finally we got to 2% after a decade of robust ADU development. So I think another thing just to recognize, both from an advocacy point of view and also just, for everybody to understand, is there's nothing to worry about here. We're not going to, and unfortunately, no matter what you do, you're not going to get a lot of ADUs built relative to the amount of properties that you have. So, so I encourage jurisdictions to really go as far as possible and making the best possible regulations, because you're still not going to get a lot of ADUs because it's really challenging to build them. So if we look at the kind of trajectory of things that Portland did to liberalize ADUs, they were allowed by right. There was no minimum lot size, and this is as of 1996 and before. There was no off-street parking requirements. There was the size cap was the primary house. They were only allowed in a certain zone. We only allowed internal conversion ADUs. There was an owner occupancy requirement. They had to be compatible with the primary house architecturally, and we don't know what the impact fees were. This resulted in a total of 50 permitted ADUs between this 15-year time span. So kind of a pitiful, pathetic number of ADUs. And then we liberalized our ADU regulations significantly by allowing them not just in one zone, but citywide. And we allowed detached ADUs, and we said, hey, we're also going to allow you to not own or occupy either property, and we're going to put a size restriction on the ADUs of 33%. And you would think at this point ADUs would lift off and take off and become super popular, and no, they did not. They did not at all. In fact, we only got about 25 per year, and in a city that has a population of 600,000, that's 140 single-family homes. So 25 per year is not a significant number, and that did not work. And that this would be the types of regulations that a lot of jurisdictions are striving for. And I'm here to say these aren't good enough. These aren't nearly good enough. So then in 2010 we said, okay, we're going to lift the size cap of the ADU, so it doesn't just have to be 33% of the size of the primary house, it's going to be 75%, and we're going to waive the impact fees as an incentive for people to build ADUs. It was only then, from a regulatory point of view, but then coupled with the activities that myself and other advocates did to kind of market ADUs, that is, run the citywide ADU tour and teach classes and do a lot of kind of research on the financial benefits of ADUs, that we finally started to see ADUs actually take off in any meaningful way. And that's when they started to double each year. And so we finally got to this stage where we are now. But I want to touch now on unpermitted ADUs, because this is something that is really interesting about ADUs, which is that most of what look and function like ADUs out there in the world, in every jurisdiction, including Portland, including Vancouver, including Annapolis, are not in fact permitted ADUs. So the question is, why are people building unpermitted ADUs? Well, first of all, they might just simply not be allowed, right? So that's one reason why people are building unpermitted ADUs as opposed to permitted ADUs. Even if they are permitted, it's a lengthy bureaucratic process to go through the process of permitting an ADU. It's much more expensive to comply with building code than not to, and taxes will go up if you do any permitted work on your property. Conversely, if you do a permitted ADU, your appraised value can go up, which means that you as the homeowner can access a home equity line of credit that is larger than you were able to access previously. It means that you can legally rent out the unit as opposed to renting out an unpermitted unit. It means that you can easily insure the unit with one telephone call to your insurance provider. For $500 a year or so, you'll be able to get additional insurance for that ADU. And you have a degree of quality assurance when you're going through the permitting process that you wouldn't get if it was an unpermitted ADU, because you've had to submit a formal set of plans that you've drawn up with an architect to the city, and then you have building inspectors come out and check in on the work during the construction process. So those are the pros and cons of why people might build an unpermitted ADU. But the bottom line is, there's a lot more unpermitted ADUs than permitted ADUs. And so if you think about the impact of ADUs, one of the things that's kind of challenging to wrap your head around is there's already more unpermitted ADUs right now in Annapolis than there will ever be permitted ADUs, even if you have the best of regulations. So weirdly, you could say that the impact that you're going to see from ADUs is already there. And so all these fears about, say, off-street parking, we're going to have so much traffic as a result of ADUs. It's like, no, you don't have so much traffic now, and you already have as more informal ADUs than you'll ever have permitted ADUs. So you don't really have to worry about permitted ADUs. So again, people are building, unpermitted ADUs because permitted ADUs aren't allowed. Unpermitted ADUs are simpler to build, they're cheaper to build, and there's no property tax increases. And these ADU impacts, to some extent or to a large extent, already exist. And so the other, way to think about this is, if we are able to create a set of regulations that compel people to build permanent ADUs, that will compel people to build more safe housing choices than what they are compelled to do now, which is unpermitted ADUs, because there is a real pressing need for this type of housing. Otherwise, we wouldn't see so much of it, whether they're permitted or not. In fact, just to dive into that a little bit more, in Los Angeles, there's studies that have shown that there's like 50,000 plus unpermitted ADUs. In Washington, D.C., there's tens of thousands of unpermitted ADUs. New York, D.C., Boston, San Francisco, every major city has tens of thousands of unpermitted ADUs because there is such a need for this type of housing. So it's really just a matter of the regulations catching up with the market, the gray market demand for this type of housing. The system development charges that we had in Portland, I want to talk about this for a minute because this ties into an interesting issue that I know will be something that people are curious about, which are short-term rentals. In the 2010, we started to see this kind of significant uptick of ADU development. And that was in part because of the system development charge waiver, which was like a $10,000 fee that was tacked on to new development of ADUs. And the city said, hey, SDCs are expensive for ADUs, so we're going to waive them. We want more density and affordable housing in Portland. ADUs will add construction jobs. We want more ADUs built, and they will be more affordable if we waive SDCs. ADUs may be added by right, and therefore we're going to waive SDCs for ADUs, and they waived them until 2013. 2013, they waived them again until 2016. 2016, they waived them again until 2018. 2018, they said, we're just going to not charge SDCs for ADUs anymore, which is good because now SDCs have increased to $19,000 to $25,000. But one thing that the city did at this point was say, we're not going to charge SDCs for ADUs anymore, but if people want to use their ADUs as a short-term rental, which was in fact a trend that we were starting to see evidence of, the city said to itself, hey, we like ADUs, we like them a lot. They serve all these policy goals, but they're not serving the same policy goal. They're not creating more housing for our citizens if they're being used as a short-term rental. So what the city said was, we're going to allow them to be used as short-term rentals, that is Airbnb, 30-day or less rentals. However, if people want to do that on their property, once they built an ADU, they have to pay the SDC, which is $19,000 to $24,000. And so lo and behold, people are not paying the SDC and not using them as a short-term rental. And I think this is a kind of a fair approach to that short-term rental conversation that will inevitably occur and arise in every city like Annapolis as they're considering ADUs, because policymakers want to see ADUs address these issues of housing supply. There isn't really one best practice as far as whether or not ADUs should be allowed as a short-term rental, but I would encourage jurisdictions to kind of think about that short-term rental set of regulations as a distinct matter from ADUs. They're not the same thing, but so it's good for a city to have a comprehensive policy about short-term rentals if short-term rentals are an issue. So simply don't allow them in residential zones, or do allow them and don't treat ADUs differently. But anyway, there's different things we could talk about with that, but this is the approach that the city of Portland has taken on that particular issue. So if we look at the cost of development, let's say the regulations are good, we've established that, and what we see are the costs in ADUs are the next kind of big barrier for development. So it's not that they're exorbitantly more expensive than other construction, but they are small on a per square foot basis. They're more expensive because they're smaller housing units, and there's these fixed costs to development. In the Portland market, I'm not going to say this is the exact same costs as they are in Annapolis, but they're probably not that far off. The least expensive ADU you can build is about $100,000. Very few people are able to do it at that price. And these are costs that are based on new construction, that is detached new construction costs, all in, that is design, permitting, utility connections, and construction costs, and also sweat equity. But these do include costs all the way back to 2011 to the 2019 ADU tour. So these are from like at least 4 years ago. So costs have actually escalated from this point, but it doesn't matter because I want to illustrate some points using this slide, which is that there is a kind of a fixed cost to development, which is like $100,000. You're not going to get them really any cheaper than that. But most people are saying to themselves, or most people are um, um, building the ADUs to the larger end of the spectrum of what they're entitled to build it at, because it's only marginally more expensive to build a larger ADU. In fact, the other way to think about that is the least expensive portion of your housing development is really the additional square footage. The most expensive portion of housing development is all these fixed costs, like you have to build a kitchen, whether it's a 200 square foot house or a 5,000 square foot house. In either case, a kitchen is going to cost $15,000. And so if you go with that same principle across all the trades and the permits and the different, electrical upgrades that you have to do for your ADU, there ends up being this like fixed cost to development that ends up being quite high. So this is vastly more expensive than most things that people will pay for in their life. And this is what makes ADU development extremely challenging above and beyond the regulations, just how you pay for this kind of investment on your property. And so the total cost of building an 800 square foot ADU these days in Portland is hovering above $200,000. For a 400 square foot ADU, it's hovering above 160. And there's more data in here if you're interested in that. And so, as a homeowner is thinking about whether or not an ADU is right for them, they're like, why would I want to build something so expensive? Well, it is really expensive, but let's think about the how quickly you can pay for that cost of construction via the additional property rental income that you can generate from that property. Now, again, these numbers will be different in Annapolis than Portland, but maybe not that different. So for an 800 square foot ADU, let's say Joe spends $180,000 and rents out the ADU for $1,800 a month. I don't know what a 1-bedroom, 1-bath unit would go for in Annapolis, but it's, think about the rental income from an ADU is going to be somewhat comparable to a new construction, a 1-unit apartment or a studio apartment. So whatever those numbers are in Annapolis is roughly the numbers you should be thinking about as far as the income potential for an ADU. And so that results in $22,000 a year of rental income for Joe, which translates to an 8.1 year payback for Joe for that rental income potential. Just gonna look at the chat here quickly. 6:48. So I have less than 10 minutes, no problem. All right. Now Joe says, I'm gonna get smart about this. I'm gonna spend $180,000. I'm gonna build the ADU, but now I'm gonna live in the ADU and rent out the primary house. That's $31,000 a year of income for Joe. That's a 5.8 year break-even period for Joe. Now Joe gets really smart about it. He says, I'm going to build the ADU, rent out the primary house and the ADU, and make $4,400 a month. That's $53,000 a year. That's a 3.4 year break-even period for Joe. Except now Joe is homeless, and that's a bummer for Joe. But in any of these situations, the return on investment is pretty good. And this isn't even looking at the contributory value of the ADU on the property. So if you assume, finger in the wind guess, that your $180,000 ADU is going to add, say, 50% of that cost. It's not going to add its full cost. It's going to add probably about half of what it costs to build. That's just a rough estimate. All of a sudden, that break-even period becomes quite a bit less. In fact, you just take these break-even periods and cut them in half. So an 8.1 year break-even period, it really only takes 4 years and 0.05 months for Joe to make enough money, $90,000, before if he was to sell the property, he wouldn't be at a loss. And so 4 years after building the ADU, Joe is not at a loss if he sells that property. So it's a really good return on investment for Joe. But if he sold it in the first 2 or 3 years, he would lose money on that deal. And that's why you don't see speculative developers building ADUs in markets generally. And of course, not everybody's building an ADU for fiscal reasons, right? So in this situation, Granny wants to live near her grandkids, so she funds the construction of a 500 square foot ADU. She pays $60,000 for the hard costs of the construction of an ADU on the son's property. The son, who owns the property, designs and builds the ADU for her. So for $60K, Granny now has a place to live rent and mortgage free, as close to her kids as she wants for as long as she wants. And meanwhile, contrast that to, say, assisted living, which costs $7,000 a month. How long would it take for Granny to burn through that $60,000 a month savings account that she has? Well, probably 9 months. Instead, now with the ADU, she has a place to live forever. The young parents, meanwhile, are investing sweat equity, the design and construction of the ADU, and they're building all this equity into their property, maybe $90,000 of equity. But then let's also consider all the other ancillary benefits to this arrangement: built-in babysitting, sharing, car sharing, meal sharing, sharing chores, property caretaking, less commuting for family social events, and the biggest benefit of all, not sharing a roof with your mother or mother-in-law as an adult. Okay, so we've established now ADUs are incredibly powerful from a financial perspective or a life flexibility perspective, but it doesn't help you as a homeowner figure out how in the world you're going to pay for this thing. So this is how people are paying for these things. It's usually a combination of these different mechanisms. It's liquid assets, that is savings, stocks, 401k loans, and then the next big bucket is home equity line of credit and a cash out refinance or a cash out refinance. So that's if you've gotten a property where you've lived in it for a few years and it's appreciated in value, you can dip into that appreciated value through a home equity line of credit or a cash out refinance and pay for the bulk of construction that way. Oftentimes, if you've lived in a property for a few years, this is going to be the lion's share of how you're going to pay for the ADU in your case. The next strategy is sweat equity. Roughly half the cost of construction is material, half is labor. And then family loans and other non-secured lines of credit is another way that people are paying for it. So that's like, parent gives you a loan and you pay them back at 5% interest. There's also credit cards available through Home Depot for goods and services from Home Depot for up to $55,000. And then there's personal lines of credit from local banks and credit unions that'll offer, 8% interest loans. Not great, but sometimes people need to get over that finish line, and this is the way to do it. And then there's also now construction loan options out there through even some national banks, like Guaranteed Rate will do construction loans for ADUs anywhere in the country using a 203k loan or a home style renovation loan. So that looks at the future value of the property once the ADU is complete, once any improvement is complete. And what they do is pay off your first loan, and then they hold that money that they're going to loan you that's based on the future value of the ADU once it's done in escrow, and they pay off the builder as the builder completes each phase of construction. And so by the time the builder is done, the bank transfers all that additional money that was in that future value loan into the builder's hands. And this is a way to build an ADU if you don't have access to appreciated equity in your property or don't have a way to use cash savings. So this is a really good mechanism, but it's a pain in the butt to use. So I wouldn't recommend going this way unless you have to. The other thing is just we've been talking about these costs for new construction. This is an example of a new construction detached ADU, but this is a garage conversion ADU, which costs roughly half that of a new construction ADU because the structural shell is already there. And same thing goes for a basement ADU. So conversions are quite a bit cheaper if they can be done at all than new construction ADUs. I only have 5 minutes left, so I'm going to kind of go fast through this stuff, but I wanted to dispel a couple myths about ADUs. They are not going to be the silver bullet to affordable housing, but it is in fact true that a very significant percentage of ADUs are rented out at far less than market rate. And in fact, 8 to 10% of all ADUs in 3 different studies that have been done are rented out at $0 per month, which is blowing any capital A affordable housing programs out of the water in terms of achieving market rate affordable housing or achieving affordable housing goals without any governmental intervention whatsoever or requirements. And presumably those ADUs that are being rented out at $0 per month are going to granny or a family member. But those people, granny or family member, would otherwise have to pay to live somewhere, right? So this is the thing that a lot of cities face is the city says, okay, we're going to legalize ADUs, and neighbors say, oh no, the sky is going to fall. We're going to get slums everywhere. We're going to get off-street parking. We're going to get parking mayhem. You're not going to be able to drive through the streets anymore. And so the city says, okay, we'll require off-street parking. We'll require owner occupancy. And it doesn't work. And the AARP has come out with a recent guidance recently called the Model State and Local Ordinance. I would recommend people refer to that for recommendations such as the ones that they're giving here, which are don't require owner occupancy requirements, don't require parking, don't require a conditional use permit, and don't have discretionary standards related to design. So these are the big changes that they're recommending. They also go into specifics about building code regulations that are enable more conversions, because in fact, conversions are the least expensive form of ADU. They're achieving all these policy objectives that we want. They're repurposing unused space and for vehicles that aren't being actually used for vehicles and turning them into housing. And that's what we really want to incentivize. But there's a lot of specifics that go into that type of thinking that needs to be thought through. And just to also bring home the impact of ADUs, I want to show the statistical impact of an ADU on a neighborhood is this. This is in Portland, this is about how many ADUs for how many houses there are, right? So it's not like there's thousands of them in any given neighborhood. Even in neighborhoods where they're very highly concentrated, this is what we see. And so when we think about the parking impacts, even in this worst case scenario, you're not going to notice an additional car located on a block as a result of ADU development. It just isn't a thing. And so I know this is a red herring of an issue that I want to just bring home, even in this hyperinflated example where there's like 10% of all the housing units have ADUs. You're not going to see impact of vehicles in these residential neighborhoods. So it's important to think about all these different development regulations when you're thinking about ADU standards. And I'm not going to go into this right now, but these are things that hopefully the city of Annapolis will be doing, following some best practices about as they develop good ADU regulations for the city. Just to summarize again, for more information, you should check out accessorydwellings.org and buildinganadu.com, where you can sign up for a bunch of information. And perhaps if you're interested, get a copy of this book, which goes into, it's written in half of it is written for homeowners who want to build an ADU, half of it is written for policymakers who want to see an ADU built, more ADUs built in their community. And it covers all those things in one roof. And you can get that on buildinganadu.com, or a $15 version is available as a digital version. So that is going to wrap it up for me. Thank you so much for taking the time to learn about ADUs, and I look forward to hearing from Alex and answering questions from you all after that.
Great, thanks, Kol. You want me to just take over here?
Yeah, I guess.
Okay,
yeah.
Great. Well, thanks. Great presentation. And so I'm going to try to build on a lot of the things that Kol talked about and bring a local flavor to it. While I'm not a native Annapolitan, I have been here 25 years. So I think I have a pretty good sense of the area, and I've been very involved in local issues. So I think I've got a reasonable handle on where the city is. Oh, so let's see. I want to share. Let's see. Okay. So what I did is I went around and took some pictures around in Annapolis, and one of the things that I want to do is just to illustrate that, as Kol mentioned, these things are in Annapolis, and it's not very hard to find them. And there have been a lot of people who have commented on the Facebook chat that they know of these things. And so in a 1-hour cursory bike trip around the city, I took a bunch of pictures, and I want to sort of show those as examples of things that could be ADUs. And so I just want to, but before I do that, I want to give a disclaimer down at the bottom that in these pictures, I have no idea what the actual use of the building is, or who's in it, who's using it, why they're using it. I'm just taking pictures from the public right of way, using visual clues as to what, as to possibly how these things could be used. And if I ended up taking a picture of anybody who's participating here, if I took a picture of your property or somebody I don't mean to imply or assert that anything's happening untoward in there. You may just be using it as storage or as a as a home office or whatever, and that's, that's completely legal. But I wanted to just at least use these examples as visual ideas of, what would happen if ADUs were legalized here. And a few general observations. They're all shapes and sizes, and I have a bunch of different examples. They're located in all neighborhoods of different income levels. So, the character of one might be different in Warder, for example, versus Ward 3, versus Ward 2, versus Ward 1. They are more common in older neighborhoods like West Annapolis and Eastport, really due to our pre-modern zoning development pattern there. They, back before we had the zoning code that we have now, people built accessory dwelling units for a lot of reasons that Kol mentioned. If you want to go find these things, look for alleys. Typically, they're found there or accessed from alleys. And in new or high-end construction on larger lots, they typically have what I'm calling auxiliary structures that aren't garages. I'll show an example in Warder, a new house being built. It's probably going to be a pool house or something, but no doubt could be livable. And that closed-in 3-season porches or walkout basements are, as Kol mentioned, not uncommon. Okay, so we'll jump into a few examples here. Here's one in West Annapolis. I actually know the person that owns this, and I've actually talked to him about it, and they're using it as an office kind of thing. But nice, and he was nice enough to share some information about it, what it costs, and without violating any confidence. It was a bit less than it was a garage. It was quite a bit less than some of the numbers that Kol had mentioned. So on conversions, if depending on the structure, it might be cheaper. Here's an example of the three-season porch. I don't know if that's just a second entrance or whether it's another unit or something, but that's the kind of thing you might see. Here's an example. I don't remember exactly where this is, but obviously it's a garage with dormers, and there's probably 800 square feet up there. I don't know what it's being used for, but it's nice looking, and there are 2 off-street parking spots there. Another example, I actually know who owns this property, and I know that's just a garage with some space upstairs, but that's the kind of thing that could be turned into a unit. Here's another example of a garage that I'm sure is not being used as a garage. I doubt you could drive that Range Rover through that door. So it's got some nice windows. Who knows what's in there? Probably just somebody's office or something. Here's an example in Homewood. It's actually quite a large garage, and I've ridden my bike there many times, and have sort of coveted the ability to get something large up through that door. It's kind of interesting. This may be not completely fair to highlight as an accessory unit, but it's maybe just a fancy potting shed. But in places, I've seen examples of ADUs in California that really are not much bigger than this, that contain a bedroom as a place to, for somebody to sleep that's not in the main house. So while this particular example may be a little small, it is indicative of things that are happening in some places. Here's an example where the accessory structure is, it's almost as big as the primary structure on the right here. And I believe it is a garage, but it looks really nice. And that's an example where it's a subservient structure, but not by much. Here's another example. I don't know if this was a garage or a second house that's now part of one property, or was built as an accessory structure originally. I'm not really sure, but it does look like a nice place that a couple could live, no problem. Here's another garage. It was probably built this way, not a conversion, but no doubt significant room upstairs. And again, fair amount of off-street parking. Here's an example. It's probably a workshop, but you can see there's a chimney stack, so certainly there's some sort of heating in there. But that's an example of something that could be a living arrangement. This actually is the backside of a garage off an alley that no doubt is got some other space that's not garage. Here's another example from similar places. No doubt this has some other use than a garage upstairs. You can tell the dead giveaway is the air conditioner. Clearly not in the greatest state of repair, but one of the things that I wanted to mention about places being shanties, one of the incentives about being able to have rental income is you're incentivized to improve it so that you can rent it. If you can't monetize that underused asset, what's your incentive for making it nicer, improving it, especially if it's just going to raise your taxes. Minor aside here, I think things we ought to look into countywide are things like land value tax, where you more heavily weight the tax of a property based on its inherent land value and not its improved value. That's why parking lots are so popular, because they pay very little taxes. But that's another story. But I think we don't want to disincentivize people from creating these things, as Kol mentioned. Here's an example in West Annapolis. I know for a fact that somebody's in-laws live in the back there. Another example where clearly there's some sort of air conditioning happening upstairs, or air conditioning, heating. Same with this one. And historic properties, in fact, have the original accessory dwellings. This is on Shipwright Avenue, and here you can see in the back is essentially a carriage house. That's sort of the quintessential accessory dwelling unit. King George Street. This is an historic house, but this garage was just built, and clearly it's more than a garage. But that's that's in the historic district. It looks nice to me. This is in Eastport. This property used to contain a multifamily house that's now a single family house, but clearly an accessory structure on part of the property. Another example, I don't remember exactly where this is, but definitely an upstairs. I think this is Eastport also. There's this, appears to be small habitable space above two-car garage. This is the example I mentioned in Warder. This is some new construction in Warder, and there's clearly another building in the back. It's not accessible to a vehicle because the driveway doesn't go back there. So yeah, I don't know if it's going to be a pool house or whatever it might be, but that's an example of where a granny flat would make a lot of sense. Another example here in the back that is a garage accessible via the driveway, but clearly going to have more upstairs than just the garage. This is also an Eastport. They almost look like completely separate dwellings. I don't think the garage has its own address, but that's maybe almost as big as my house. But that's an example of a larger building. Another one off an alley, probably not being used for much, at least from what I can see. Here's an example of something that I know is a mother-in-law suite, because I know the folks that own, or the prior owners anyway, that let us some house guests of mine stay there. but that's an example of a walkout. Here's another example off an alley of a nice garage with some upstairs space. And yet another, again, you can tell the telltale sign of an air conditioner. Another example of a garage that has doors that probably aren't garage doors. Some of the one that I showed initially. Another one in West Annapolis that almost looks like its own house. It's actually part of the property on the left, but it's really a garage with some space upstairs. I've always been curious about that. And I'll end lastly with this garage apartment that is actually right across the street from my house. So if you turned 180 degrees, you'd be looking at my house. Over the years that I've been in my house, now about 25 years or 23 years, this one-room apartment with a little kitchen and bathroom has been rented by a number of people. The owner got had to vacate it several times because of the legality of it. But one of the things that I would mention is that when it was rented by several people who were, I got to know a little bit, were quite nice, is the exterior appearance of this building was 100% better when there was somebody living there. Somebody took care of it, they spruced it up, and as it's sat empty because it's not legal to live there, it's gone slightly fallow. So that's an example of when there's typically somebody living there, they're going to take care of it. And so I will end there, and I guess we will go back to the moderators and deal with some questions.
All right, thank you so much, Alex. And of course, Kol, for your interesting presentations. Super appreciate you being here with us today and giving us all of your expertise. My name's Luke. I have the honor and joy of presenting to you the questions from our audience. So the first couple of questions I can hand to you, Kol, if that's all right. If you wouldn't mind, can you give us just a reminder of the percentages of ADUs that are new construction, versus sort of conversions? And then the sort of second part of that is, would these units be available only for rent, or could you sort of subdivide the plot and then, sell it on as a sort of, affordable housing?
Yeah, so ADUs are inherently like part of the primary dwellings property, and therefore typically cannot be subdivided. There's some code experimentation going on in that particular issue. And you can condoize ADUs, at least in Portland, because state law allows for that. So there is ways to theoretically partition off ADUs, but generally speaking, it's not easy to do that. And they're thought of as just an accessory part of the primary house. And as far as the percentages, it's what we have from one snapshot in this survey that was done in 2013 is 50% of ADUs are detached new construction, 25% are garage conversions or ADUs above a garage associated with the garage in some way. And then 25% are basement conversion ADUs. There's also bump out ADUs and attic conversion ADUs and other types of internal carve out ADUs, but generally speaking, those are the breakdowns.
All right, thank you. So we've got a couple questions about the bill that's currently in front of the Annapolis City Council. The first of which being, so if the Annapolis City Council were to legalize ADUs, but would, the new bill, would legalize ADUs, but would not allow the owner to short-term rent them. According to a Bloomberg article in California, where ADUs were legalized, only 8% of the properties were used by Airbnb. So the question is, are there restrictions on whether the ADU can be used as a short-term rental? And if not, is it known how many ADUs are used for short-term rentals?
Go ahead, Alex.
So I just wanted to bring, I don't really have any data on that, but one of the things that I wanted to mention about short-term rentals is, I think the issue that, especially downtown in Ward 1, the biggest issue with ADUs is that it's been a detriment to the feeling of community in those neighborhoods. If there's a significant amount of short-term rentals, there's sort of nobody living there that has any skin in the game. I'm sure there are a number of ways to address that issue. Certainly, one of them is owner occupancy, where the accessory unit or the primary unit has to be lived in by the owner, and that still gives them stake in the neighborhood to essentially, be there to participate in civic life. But also, I think the fear is it alleviates the fear of not being able to police the unit. But as I'm sure Kol can indicate, the owner occupancy is a two-edged sword. There are pluses and minuses. I think I talked about the plus side of it, especially with respect to how that's viewed, or how short-term rentals are viewed in Annapolis. But I'm sure that that there's other experience that might lead to a different solution.
So I know that this bill explicitly doesn't allow short-term rental. So, so that's one thing to sort of make point of. But what, in your experience, what is considered short-term? I mean, obviously if it was a week or two or something, but somebody could argue theoretically, 3 months isn't that short, or 6 months is, so is there a line weight that you would draw between what's a short-term rental and what's not?
What's been talked about here in the past with respect to short-term rentals is about 3 months. So anybody there that's going to be there 3 months is, that's not short-term. I think short-term typically is considered, 2 to 7 days kind of thing.
So you had spoken about some of the average costs involved of, in terms of Portland anyway, and obviously, as you said, the numbers here in Annapolis are going to be, a little different depending on sort of the market and so on. But in general, apart from the ways that you had mentioned, how are people kind of financing the ADUs? Are they able to get a sort of a traditional mortgage for that, or does it tend to be a more specialized type of loan?
Yeah, it's a combination of the patchwork of different mechanisms that I talked about before. It's cash savings, home equity line of credit or cash out refinance, family loans, and credit card debt, and then also personal lines of credit. And then if none of those are viable for one reason or another, then it's construction loan financing, which is kind of a pain in the butt, but it can be done. So
as we know, I'm choosing my words very carefully here as to this question. So if there are illegally built ADUs, what would you say is the best sort of form of action? How did they combat that in Portland, or did they sort of grandfather the ones that were there, or how did that work?
Yeah, so first of all, I'd say that's the best indicator. The presence of informal ADUs is the best indicator of the desperate need for this type of housing, right? So from a regulatory point of view, politicians should be saying, oh my God, people are willing to risk that much to build these ADUs. Clearly, we need to have better ADU regulations so people don't have to build them illegally in order to have them. But as far as the specific standards, it's really complicated to legalize unpermitted ADUs because, and it's a long conversation, but bottom line is the best thing you can do is have really flexible zoning regulations and building code regulations that I can go into in great depth, but don't have the time to do so now, that enable people to take permitted structures that were built that wouldn't be compliant now, but that would be grandfathered in as long as all you're doing is changing the use of that structure. So if a garage was allowed to be built in one location, you would be able to get a by right approval to change the use of that structure from car habitat to human habitat. And same thing goes for the structural integrity of the building. Like, you don't have to bring up the old foundation to current building code just because you're changing the use. And the list goes on and on and on, but that's what I would say.
Yeah, and if I can just follow on with that, one of the things that I'm sure will come up in our context is when you have a building that's being renovated, say a garage that's being upgraded to be an ADU, that's essentially non-conforming because of something like setbacks, the question will come up about how much of a renovation is allowed before it's, before it's not considered a renovation anymore. And we have this problem throughout the city, and it's not for ADUs, but for all kinds of construction with respect to things that are non-conforming now. So that no doubt will come up. It'll have to be addressed at some level.
Well, and we did have a couple of questions. I think you've answered them actually, about some of the sort of off the books informal ADUs, as you had mentioned. Some of them might look awesome. I mean, they might be beautiful in keeping with the neighborhood and all of that. So there would be an argument for kind of grandfathering them or figuring out how do we make that a thing. At the same time, they aren't all that. So how do you kind of keep the quality level up? But I had a specific question from one of the audience. It says, we have at least 3 ADUs in our neighborhood and find that because of the narrow streets and our 1-car driveways, 4 to 6 vehicles sometimes per ADU, plus commercial trucks in some cases and vans, parking has become very difficult. How in a small family or a single family home can the city guarantee sufficient parking?
I would dispute the claim that there's 4 to 6 vehicles added to any given property for an ADU. I don't think that's true. I mean, because ADUs, we actually have evidence and data to support the contributory number of ADU vehicles per ADU based on an actual survey of ADUs that was really done with real data, and it's actually fewer cars per ADU than per capita than in single family homes. So I would encourage you to look at the study from Portland on that. Now, I'm not going to say like every city is just like Portland, but it's actual real data based on real research, based on real survey data, not just anecdotal. So ADUs are inherently small. They're only going to have 1 or 2 people in them typically. So it would be disingenuous to assume that you could create 4 vehicles for that. Usually it's going to be like 0.7 or something per ADU.
Sure. Anecdotally, I can say in my own personal experience, I know, and Alex had sort of pointed out a couple of pictures. There are definitely some ADUs in our neighborhood that are almost bigger than the house that they're, sort of next door to or whatever. And some of them certainly do have a number of vehicles, but they probably are in the minority in terms of the general numbers. Are there any restrictions on the size of an ADU? Sort of following up, like, is there a kind of maximum? You can't make it bigger than the house or whatever.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think Annapolis's proposal does have a size restriction, which I don't think is a bad idea. I think that's fine. And because the reason why that's a good idea is because we want to create smaller housing units in order to create housing supply for the 1 and 2 person household demographic, which is swamping our demographics, and we don't have housing for them. So a size cap is good. Whether that size cap is 600, 800, 1200, it's by variation. There's no best practice on that. It can be kind of whatever number is set. I would just say, just as a point of fact, 850 square feet, which is the proposal on the table, is fine. That would allow for 2 bedrooms, 1 bath, and 2 bedrooms, 2 bath, perhaps. And so if Annapolis feels like that's the demographic that it wants to fill, then great. If you want to potentially provide more 3-person households, 3-unit, 3-bedroom houses, and you want to up that a little bit. If you want to do 1 bedroom only, you want to do 600 square feet. But those are just some thoughts on that.
So I believe a friend of mine just sent me some information here that the maximum in Annapolis is going to be 850 square feet, minimum 150 square feet. But studies have shown that ADUs have been shown to increase the sort of walkability of an area. Can you speak a little more about that, rather, as opposed to cars?
Yeah, I mean, so ADUs, one of the, what I didn't touch on in the presentation regarding the environmental footprint is of ADUs is like, in addition to them being smaller housing units by virtue of the regulations, they're also, the market will drive them to be in more highly walkable, bikeable neighborhoods because that's where the rental market demand is greater and that's where the return on investment will be greatest. So just without any governmental intervention whatsoever, they will tend to be built in more walkable, bikeable areas. At least that's my hypothesis based on now seeing ADUs being developed in a number of cities, and that seems to be what's occurring. And I did see another question regarding like where ADUs have been taking off, and I think I'll just speak briefly to that, which is they're really only taking off in like a handful of cities, and that's, you know, it has to be the right conditions, it has to be the right regulatory conditions and the right market conditions, and so we're seeing it in a big way happen in Seattle, Portland, the Bay Area, Los Angeles, and Austin, Texas, and that's it. It's not like it's a very small handful of cities where this is going. There's no cities east of Austin where it's really taking off yet because the regulations aren't caught up to where they need to be.
So as a sort of a quick follow-up to that, I mean, clearly Annapolis is a very historic city. You know, we have neighborhoods that have been here for a very long time, and they have a particular sort of look and a feel, the heritage aspect of the homes. And so are there any aspects of the legislation or that we could suggest, you know, in terms of if needed to be added or anything like that, to sort of preserve the concerns of people that are worried about the look and feel of their neighborhood?
Yeah, I mean, I think at least what we're doing in Portland is just it goes to the historic design review process for a historic neighborhood. Historic neighborhoods can't prevent ADUs, but you have to follow the same standards and guidelines that you would follow for new single-family home construction in historic neighborhoods. And I think that's a reasonable way to go about it. I don't think historic neighborhoods should be able to exclude themselves from allowing ADUs.
Yeah, I would say that, you know, in Annapolis here, anything that would be built in the historic district obviously would, like anything else, would have to go through the Historic Preservation Commission. So, you know, they certainly would get a chance to weigh in on it.
So I have a couple of questions about rent, sort of a couple of aspects here. So first of all, are there any restrictions on short-term rentals on the ADUs that you have in Portland? And in your experience, does setting a maximum amount of rent result in fewer ADUs getting built or converted? And if that's the case, would it make sense to allow short-term rentals in an ADU if there was, for example, some kind of documentation or like a contract or whatever with somebody else that was going to be a long-term rental after that? So for example, let's say you had an elderly relative who said, hey, I'm moving to Annapolis from Portland, but it's going to take me 3 months to get there. So in the meantime, go ahead and rent it. In your opinion, would that make sense? Or should we just not have short-term rentals?
It does make sense. Conceptually, I think it would be really hard to administer. I totally get that scenario. It's a very real life scenario. And so clearly this person has like thought through the real world implications of these kinds of restrictions. What I will say as a general matter is restricting ADUs to various forms of like affordability doesn't work. That doesn't work at all. In fact, it prevents people from building ADUs. So that isn't a good strategy. And furthermore, ADUs are already more affordable than every other housing type out there, as I mentioned in my presentation. So if you're going to restrict, you know, if you're going to require certain affordability restrictions, restrict them for everything other than ADUs, which are already better than everything else out there. Restrict it for single family homes. Don't do it for ADUs. ADUs are cheaper than everything else because they are smaller.
Yeah, and I would say that, you know, one of the things we want to encourage here is resiliency, and not in a necessarily climate change way, but in a personal resilience kind of way, where you essentially might have an underutilized asset, this accessory structure, and you want people to be able to monetize that asset and to make it as flexible as possible. As in the example you used, you know, maybe short-term rental makes sense for where you are in your life. And another, you know, then you'll stop doing that and you'll make it a kid's playroom, and then you'll make it a home office, and then you'll make it an in-law suite. I think that being very prescriptive on how it can be used and what it can be used for and what you might charge for it to allay is the wrong solution to address other concerns that people might have. And I think we touched on those a little bit, like the having people have some sense of the community. That clearly is an issue, but you don't want to tie people's hands where they say, well, okay, I'm just not going to rent it then because it's not worth the trouble. I think you should try to address those concerns in a more targeted way, maybe through other means, and not just sort of blanket restrictions like no short-term rentals, or only this kind of rental, only that kind of rental, or only this much or that much. Just too prescriptive.
We had some questions. One of the things, as you'll probably know from being in Annapolis for a while, is if we have very heavy weather, especially rain, that we can get a lot of flooding, and a lot of that can cause issues. Cause concerns about impermeable surfaces, stormwater runoff, all of that stuff. So I suppose this question really applies to probably more new construction rather than, converting an existing structure, because theoretically they would have taken that into account, although that's not always the case. So what would your recommendations be about, the sort of impermeable surface situation? Because clearly if you're adding a unit, there might be a need for a more driveway, additional hard top, basically.
I can take that one. The regulations for any that will still have to be followed for impervious surface will be the same. So if you have the ability to have more footprint, whether you're going to put an addition on your house because you want a family room, or whether you're going to build an ADU, if you don't have the room, if you don't have the room to do that with respect to impervious surface, you can't do it. So I think that's kind of already handled in regulation elsewhere. And then, as we showed in these examples, most of these buildings are already impervious surface. So I think a lot of the use around here would be through existing conversions, not necessarily new construction, because we're a fairly mature city in most parts.
So Kol, a couple of questions specifically for yourself. Could you please talk about the concept of limiting ADU rent by deed restrictions? So for example, limiting it to say 80% median income. And also, can you talk a little bit about sort of using tiny homes as ADUs? Los Angeles, San Diego area have encouraged that. It seems to be a thing that a lot of people are getting into, is sort of tiny homes. And if an Annapolitan bill does pass, how, in your opinion, and Alex, you could probably jump in on this part, will it affect zoning limitations on building versus green space?
Yeah, so as far as the affordability question, tethering ADUs to affordable housing programs does not work, because it's already, as I've expressed, a really difficult thing to build ADUs. But if we make it even more difficult by saying, oh, you have to rent it out to a Section 508 program, and you have to follow this and that regulation, people aren't going to do it. It's already hard enough. We want to make it as easy as possible. Even programs out there that have been experimented with on the West Coast, where they're saying, well, we'll give you really good loan offerings for ADU development if you do restrict it to low-income renters, those don't work. Like it's just people do not want to tether the use of these ADUs, which are, the primary driver is flexibility and rental income, to affordability, even if that is in fact what they will end up doing, is renting them out for affordable rates because they're mom and pop landlords renting it out to their brother-in-law. So that's one. Tiny homes on wheels, I think, are a great thing to look at. It's might be a little bit too wild of an idea to consider at this point in time, but I would say we are doing it. We are now in the process of legalizing not only tiny houses on wheels, but actually RVs. Tiny houses on wheels start at $50,000, go up to $100,000. RVs, used RVs, you can get for $10,000 right now in Annapolis on Craigslist, and we're going to make those legal dwellings, and that's pretty pretty out there from a national advantage, but I think that's actually the right direction to create market rate affordable housing. What California is doing is legalizing park model RVs as a form of ADUs, and good idea. I don't actually think that's going to work that well. Not very many have been built, but they're experimenting with that out there.
So we're coming towards the end, and I just got 2 more questions, so we're going to try and answer them quickly. So first of all, can you give us some brief background on the sort of number of unpermitted, sort of off the books ADUs that are currently, in your estimation, Alex is probably best for this, in Annapolis? And has the city or anyone else done any research on actual numbers? And then I'll save the last question for after you've answered that.
To my knowledge, and the city of Annapolis has no numbers about that. One thing that they did publish just tangentially that is in the last legislation was looked at through GIS analysis that potentially 34% of single family lots could have an ADU, but that made an assumption that there was nothing already on the lot, and that you could orient 2 buildings to satisfy the requirements, and I think that scared a lot of people, but it was a red herring, and that just to me shows that they just really have no data on either what could actually work based on certain regulations, or how many of these things exist off book.
So the last question actually comes from one of our aldermen, Alderman Shandemeyer, who's going to be actually a panelist on the second one of these on April the 20th. But also another question, I'm just going to kind of roll into it because it's on the same subject, which is there can be in existence out there the sort of NIMBY, not in my backyard mentality. People think it's a great idea until it's next door, and then they think, oh, now brings down the class of the neighborhood or whatever. And I'm not making a judgment on that, by the way, just for the record. So the question from Alderman Shandemeyer is, the bill that is going through Annapolis, one of the fears that has come up more than once is that it will encourage shanties. So what are the steps that we all can take to discourage that misconception and to combat it?
Well, I mean, the truth is ADUs are going to be built to current building code, and they're going to be built as new construction or conversions of existing structures. So the reality is they're actually going to be nicer than the primary house. That's the truth. In terms of they're going to be more comfortable, they're going to be built to better building standards, they're probably going to look better than the primary house. So it's a vast misconception. I think it's accurate conception to say that informal ADUs might not be as nice, which incidentally means that they're going to be less expensive to rent, which incidentally is actually the policy objective that people want to solve for. So I will put that as a side note, but so I'm a fan of informal ADUs for that very reason. But yeah, as far as the perception of legalizing permanent ADUs causing shanty towns is completely opposite of what actually is the reality.
Well, thank you.
I would agree.
Thank you also for Alex for all of your expertise, all your answers. I don't have any other questions right now, but I do have thanks for you. I want to thank Action Annapolis, of course, for holding this. Encourage all of our audience to join us again on April the 20th. Please do join us for that, which the theme of that is, can ADUs, of course, work in the Annapolis area? And we'll have a panelist of a group of panelists, I should say, from Annapolis, elected officials and local community leaders and so on, to be part of that. And so that will be certainly very interesting. So please do kind of keep your eyes open for information about that and join us then. Also, of course, we always love your feedback at Action Annapolis. So please take a moment to fill out a little survey that we have. We would really, really appreciate it. We'll put the link in the chat, but also I'll just tell you it's actionannapolis.com, which is the website, of course, /feedback. So if you go on there and fill out a survey, we'd really appreciate that. There's going to be a number of events coming all throughout the year, and of course this fall with featuring the candidates that are running for the city council and for mayor of Annapolis. So that will be interesting as well. Stay tuned on the social media, Facebook pages and all of those. And of course, actionannapolis.com. And if you want to be on the mailing list so that you can find out about more events like this, please send an email to info@actionannapolis.com. And of course, you'll get signed up and we'll sort of keep you in the loop. I appreciate you bearing with me. As I said, I have been Luke. I've been your audience specialist. I want to say thank you to Sonia, Alex, Emily, and even though she's behind the scenes, Amy Brett, who's made all of this happen. And we will see you again on April the 20th. Thanks so much for being here and have a great night.
Thanks. It's a great discussion.